Okay, guys, so we are live, and this is Unit 5, Medieval Art, AP Art History Review. Go ahead and start asking me questions. I can see the live chat here. I do have a few questions that have come in through Twitter, but do remember, guys, that I will only answer questions so long as there are questions. So right now I have 2 to work off of and nothing else. So I'm going to send a message out via Remind. So if you will forgive me for just a second, let me go ahead and take care of that, and then I will get to Juliana's questions on Twitter. But in the interim, I can see that there are 5 people watching, so presumably there are people with questions. So while I send out a Remind message letting everybody know that we're live, you guys go ahead and type your questions in the live chat for me, okay? So hang on, otherwise I'm going to knock over my hot chocolate if I'm not careful. All right, let's see here. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance at this point to take a look at, say, the study guide that I put up. I put it up sometime around 4:30 or 5 while I was waiting for people to finish a makeup test, not a makeup test, take early test. So make sure that you go through it and see if there are any terms that you're unaware of or unfamiliar with, and I will try to get to. So I am seeing Bethel's question in the live chat. I'll answer that and then address Juliana's. And hopefully by then I'll have some other questions coming in as well. So make sure you pull up that study guide, review it, see if there's anything that you desperately want me to address. So let's see here. Bethel wants me to explain the differentiation between the cruciform and basilica designs of churches. Okay, that is a really, really good question. So basilica form is much older than whatchamacallit, than cruciform forms of churches. And essentially, basilica is a Roman modification of the traditional Greek form of temple. Remember, Greek temples had they were rectangular in shape. They were oriented east-west. Think about the Parthenon up on the Acropolis in Athens, and they had columns. And columns formed colonnades down the sides and across the front. I'm drawing right now, so in a moment I'll put up an illustration. So you had these Greek-style temples like the Parthenon. This is a terrible drawing, but you have these Greek-style temples like the Parthenon that are designed during the Greek classical period. The Romans like that design and they emulate it in terms of their design for their temples. There are a few modifications that they make and some that they go totally off the book on, like, say, the Pantheon. So the Pantheon is nothing like a Greek temple in terms of its interior. Its exterior with the pediment and the columns across the front is fairly similar. But the Romans, what they tend to do is they start using that basic rectangular colonnaded form as the base for a meeting place design, a civic space. And that civic space is going to become a basilica. Now, the way that they do this is they kind of eliminate the columns across the front of the meeting place. And they add on a circular, semicircular sort of niche at the end that is called the apse. And there's colonnades going down either side of the basilica itself. I'm drawing things out. I need to draw faster. And then the colonnades follow behind the shape of the apse itself. So basilica form in general is a Roman style, and it's characterized by 2 colonnades, 2 lines of columns. It's usually at least 2 to 3 stories tall. Sometimes you can have rows of columns, or rather stories of columns stacked on top of each other. And then you have that rounded apse at the end. And that was traditionally a place where you would have sort of a statue of, say, Caesar, etc., or some sort of votive, or sort of, if it's a civic space, it might be a statue or some sort of, not triumphal arch, but a column, or sort of like stela-like sort of monument to brave deeds. That would be what would be in the apse there. So the basilica is this traditional Roman form of architecture. So we have to remember that Christianity develops in the Roman world. And as a result of this, early Christian churches like, which one's basilica form? It's not San Vitale. Santa Sabina, if you were trying to reach for it. It's Santa Sabina is in basilica form. And early Christians, what they start to do is once Christianity kind of comes out of the shadows and can be openly practiced, they start using the available sort of vernacular of architecture to express their faith. And so early Christian churches tend to be built in basilica form. There are a couple of modifications that they add to it, like the baptistry. Baptistries, and I don't believe I put it down on your vocabulary terms, but it's not a bad one to know in general. Baptistries were frequently separate buildings, usually located kind of down towards the apse. Sometimes there'd be sort of a separate exit towards the baptistry, but they could be separate buildings. And that would be where the baptismal ceremonies would be taking place. In a baptistry, essentially, what there is a font in the center, not a fountain, just a font. If you're not sure what that is, a font is just sort of a basin filled with water. In this case, it's holy water, and it's been blessed. That's the big difference. And it's used for baptism ceremonies. It's a reference to the portion in the Bible where Jesus is baptized, and baptizes other people and washes people's feet, and so like baptism is a sacrament, etc. The baptistry was sometimes separate from the rest of the church, sort of like you needed to be baptized and then you could do the church thing. Eventually, the font will become part of the church itself. So initially, you could have sort of like the early Christian churches like Santa Sabina. The baptistry would sometimes be separate. Other characteristics of Christian churches that start to develop in terms of those early Christian churches that are using basilica form is the narthex. So the narthex, beyond being endlessly fun to say, and you should say it as often as you possibly can, the narthex is essentially sort of like the waiting area before you go into the nave itself. So remember, in the church, the central portion where the congregants would be is called the nave. The side portions of the church in between the colonnade and the exterior walls, those are called aisles. Actually, it's incorrect. Like, when people talk about like Christian wedding ceremonies and they talk about like the bride marching down the aisle, no, she's not. The aisles are actually on the side. They're on the side of the church. It's not the central portion. The central portion is the nave. That's what it is. So the narthex is sort of the portico, the porch, the entrance to the church itself. So when you enter into a church, there's usually sort of like a lobby space. It might feel best to just call it a lobby if that makes sense to you. But there's this lobby space, and part of it was to kind of control the flow of traffic. It also sometimes had a place where penitents would wait, meaning like people who needed to seek confession, or were there to kind of purify themselves. It would be sort of like a ritual holding space before you felt like you could approach the altar itself. So basilica churches have those two long columns. It wraps around the altar back behind the apse. The baptistry is usually separate in early basilica form churches. The narthex is present as kind of the entrance. Then we eventually get to cruciform churches. Cruciform churches are essentially, they really start developing during late insular, early Romanesque period. And part of why they're developed is, first of all, it's kind of the writ large version of Christian symbolism. So I'm going to draw it out again here. So the whole church makes a giant, oh, that's terrible. The whole church makes a giant cross, okay? So the shape of the church is really, it's still that elongated rectangular form. It still has the semicircular asp at the end, okay? But it has something different to it. And the big difference here is the transepts. The transept is a crossbar that makes the horizontal, like if you think of the cross upright for the crucifixion, the transept is the crossbar upon which Christ's arms would have been nailed. So that's the transept. And part of the reason for this design, sorry, my ear is itching, pardon me. Part of the reason for this design is because of the fact that um, uh, pilgrimage during the Romanesque period had really accelerated, and that meant that you had crowds of hundreds, if not thousands, of people visiting some of these larger churches and their associated relics. And that meant that if everybody came in through the narthex and then traipsed along the aisles to go and observe these relics, like, you had a traffic flow problem. So what these churches do is with these transepts, you have multiple entrances and exits to churches. And if you've been in basically any traditional style cathedral anywhere in the United States or over in Europe, this is the predominant form that we see. There's usually the main doors to the church, and then there are side exits out the transepts. So what you have is that long colonnade. You've got the narthex still, but you've got that long colonnade that goes the length of the church, wraps around the apse as per usual, but you also have columns that describe the shape of the transepts as well. Okay, so the columns go all the way along what essentially is a modified basilica form, and then they also go along the transepts. Now, in late Romanesque architecture, there's some additional forms that get added in, right? Like the radiating chapels that kind of come out behind the apse. So those are elements to cruciform churches that you won't see in basilica form churches. Today, cruciform is the predominant form. Other things you should just remember in general, most churches of the medieval period are oriented east-west. The altar is in the apse. It faces the east towards the rising sun. The west is where you enter from, usually kind of like you're entering from sin, sort of like the setting of the sun, death almost, and looking towards the resurrection. It's highly symbolic as to why they're orienting the space in that direction. So hopefully, Bethel, that answers your question. I'm going to jump over here to Juliana's questions online right now through Twitter, and then I'll get to Ali and Tiara's questions, okay? So Juliana wants to know what the difference between a pendentive and a squinch is. Okay, first of all, this whole unit is full of terms that are super fun to say. So a pendentive versus a squinch. So pardon me, my hot chocolate is going to get cold. It's very chilly outside. And I'm sitting by a window, and it's kind of cold. Okay. I'm going to wind up with a hot chocolate mustache. All right. So Juliana wants to know the difference between a pendentive and a squinch. So both of those are means by which early architects in the post-Roman era tried to figure out how to support a dome. Okay, domes are problematic. Arches are problematic. Anything where you're trying to get the ceiling to stay up without actively having a support holding it up, like post and lintel style, like a hypostyle hall, it's really, really challenging. So one of the big things that they were trying to figure out was how to create a huge freestanding dome, a la sort of the Pantheon, only bigger, without needing any supports in the middle. So the example of this is the Hagia Sophia, and also, frankly, San Vitale has some pretty impressive dome work to it as well. So there's a couple of ways you can go about this. The primary way that they tended to do it was to think of, and I do apologize to my artists out there, I am less than gifted in terms of architectural drawings, so just bear with me. And, you know, I know that you guys laugh at my drawings on the board, but like, I am hampered by the fact that it doesn't pick up my pen movements particularly well. Okay, so the way that most architects tried to deal with the problem of domes in the early medieval period was really to kind of think about the domes as being supported through arches. So you would have kind of this open space that you wanted the dome to soar over. And it really kind of helped to almost think of the dome as resting on something. So I'm trying to draw this out properly. So I do apologize for the time a bit here. But basically, the idea was to have these domes supported by a series of arches. These are not particularly well drawn to scale, but we will pretend like it makes sense. Okay. Okay. All right. So just so you can kind of see which ones I'm actually looking at here, I'm going to color them in a little bit so you can. Okay. It's terrible, but that's all right. Okay. So what we have here is a really poorly drawn attempt by Miss Galloway to depict 4 arches coming together to form sort of a hallway or a doorway, sort of this open space. And on top of these 4 arches, I want to place a dome. Okay. Gosh, that's even worse when I'm looking at it on the YouTube stream here. Okay, so I want to place a dome on top of this structure. So imagine like taking a tennis ball and cutting it in half and just sitting on top of it. Well, that could potentially work, except your dome is very, very, very heavy. And you're taking a round shape and trying to place it on top of a square shape. And you need to do this because what you need is for the weight of that dome, which is going to be enormous, to be driven down into the ground, to not wobble or shift outward. You don't want to have flying buttresses. They don't know how to do that yet. So what they need to do is they're going to try and figure out how to support these domes. So a pendentive, what they will wind up doing is they take that arch of the arch itself and they fill it in and they bring it up even further. And I'm trying to draw it so that you can actually see it here. They take that arch and they bring it up further and they shrink the size of the square that they're trying to span. So I'm going to try. The problem is that I really do need to be a better architectural drawing for this to make sense for you guys. So essentially what they're going to do is they're going to take the shape of the arch and they're going to extend it up and you get these almost triangular shapes. That is a pendentive. And then sitting on top of it, that's where your dome would be. So your dome will be smaller than the squared off arch sort of area that you are trying to support it with. And that makes it easier to support. This is the method by which they support the Hagia Sophia. This is how they do that. The walls themselves have these great arches to them, and then there are pendentives, and it holds up that central arch, that soaring central arch, and then they replicate it several other times with 4 smaller arches on either side of the great arch dome. And that essentially distributes a lot of the weight. So that's a pendentive. Squinches, oh gosh, it just froze in a really great position. That's awesome. So squinches are a little bit different. Instead of continuing that arch up and then bringing it in further and then sitting the dome on top of it, what you do is essentially you leave the arch where it is. You don't extend it up. You just kind of fill in the top of the space in between one arch and the other, and you kind of cut the corner. Imagine like taking a board and laying it across 2 corners. That's what essentially they're doing. So instead of bringing the arch up and then setting it on top of those 2 arches, you just kind of square off the corner and then set the dome down on top of it. Squinches are a little bit less complex. That's what the Romans tended to do. If they really wanted to put a dome on top of something, they built a squinch. Pendentives are a little bit more refined. They're also more difficult to build. The Hagia Sophia is really the first they managed to do that fairly successfully. You can get a higher dome with a pendentive. And then eventually, as we see, if you increase the pitch, if you make the pitch even higher, you can get a bigger dome and it won't need as much support. Shallow domes, shallow arches are troublesome because it forces the weight that it's carrying outwards instead of down. And really what you want to do is force that weight down so that it doesn't collapse. So Let's see here. Ali, I'm going to get to your question. Can I explain the transition from Roman-style figures to Byzantine style figures? Oh, Ali, that is one of your guiding questions, which means it potentially could be an essay question. So I'm not going to answer that question specifically, but if you ask me in a moment about characteristics of each one of those, or something like that, I could definitely do that. But you need to paraphrase the question because I'm not going to answer your essay question right here. All right. Other question for Ali. Ali wants to know, on the test tomorrow, are we going back to doing just 2 free response questions, or are we going to do just one at the last test? Good question, Ali. I'm going to just give you one, and the reason for that is I happen to know you'll have a fire drill at the start of class. So I'm going to give you some time at the very beginning of class to study, because we're going to be interrupted 10 minutes in, or a little bit less than 10 minutes in. So I'm going to shorten the FRQ there. Don't panic, I said FRQ, but like I don't mean the formal type because I haven't taught you how to write those yet, which we'll do on Friday. So yeah, you'll only have one short answer for me. Okay, because otherwise we may run short on time. I am hoping to do the full 80 questions, but we'll see how it works, okay? Yeah, all right, hopefully that helps you answer that question a little bit. Let me go back to Juliana. Juliana's got another question for me on here. Juliana wants me to briefly go over the main characteristics of each type of church plan, but I have already done, let's see here, I've already done basilica, I've already done cruciform. One other kind we could talk about is Greek cross. Okay. So in Christian iconography, there's a couple of different types of crosses. You have the traditional Latin type of cross, which is kind of short on top, short transepts. Well, they're not really transepts at this point. And then sort of the long pole at the bottom. Yeah, this is a traditional Roman cross. Then we have Greek crosses. Greek crosses tend to be short and squat, more like the red cross symbol. That tends to be a little bit more like the Greek cross. So Greek cross church plans use that general design. And in the center of Greek cross church plans, that is hard for me to say, usually the nave is circular. The nave is usually circular, and what you have are sort of 4 major portions of the church coming off, almost like 4 transepts. And then the apse is always pointing east because that's what they do, okay? And then the narthex is at the west. Usually Greek cross church plans are fairly old. You're more likely to find them in the Byzantine Empire. They were more popular during, say, like the 500s and 600s. Yeah, they're pretty old style construction. Okay, they usually do have colonnades simply because they're trying to achieve that height, and they almost needed them at that time. Because they're so early, they really haven't developed any of those pointed arches or anything like that. So they do need those columns in order to achieve height. So Greek cross church plans are sort of they're not a modified cruciform form because cruciform is Western Europe, but they do have sort of 4 intersecting areas and then a circular nave in the center. That's really the big differences there. Okay, let's see here. Tara wants to know, why were the illusionary techniques criticized during early Christian art? Ali, this one helps you with your previous question, but is not worded exactly as I wrote it on the paper. Okay. Apologies. Okay. So illusionary techniques are essentially the techniques that create the illusion that something is 3-dimensional or that something is real. So the Romans got really good at this, and so too did the Greeks, right? Think about the realistic quality of, say, late archaic into classical Greek Hellenistic sculpture, although Hellenistic sort of sculpture tends to get like super kind of imaginative in some ways. I keep thinking of the fellow with the serpent. That one's my personal favorite of the Hellenistic arts. But you can also think about sort of the hyper-realism of the late Roman Republic with the ancestor portraits and things like that. So clearly people were capable of producing incredibly lifelike depictions of human beings, right? And if you think back to the frescoes inside the House of Veti in Pompeii, clearly they had some perspective techniques as well that gave the illusion of distance. You could paint in false, false architectural details and windows and give the illusion of distance. Now, it's not one point linear perspective, which we will get to next unit, yay. But it is important in that it gives the illusion of space. So you can kind of create, like, if you don't have any windows, you can paint in windows. And the Romans could certainly do that. But what happens is that during the early Christian period, there is an attempt to kind of distance the Christian artistic production from the pagan, meaning sort of polytheistic pre-Christian past, and draw a strong line. Additionally, there were theological concerns about whether or not it was appropriate to depict figures, depict anything, depict life. If you think about prohibitions in Exodus, which is part of the Old Testament or part of the Torah, there are specific prohibitions against graven images, against idols and things like that. And depending on your reading and interpretation of that text, it may mean that having any sort of not icons in the religious sense, but iconography or symbolism of the real living world is an attempt to kind of wrestle the onus of creation away from God and into the hands of man. And that would be deeply problematic. St. Augustine himself thought that that actors were liars, right? That they get up and they speak in front of you, that an image painted of something is a lie. It's trying to trick you into believing something that is not real. And so Christian artists kind of were wrestling with these sort of ideas about, is it too pagan, too Roman to use those sort of really illusionary techniques to make monumental stone sculpture that looks like it might breathe? Is that a sin? Is that a problem? And that's why you see this big move away from sort of a lot of the traditional Roman techniques. I mean, it's not like people forgot how to use shading when they were painting on walls or when they were doing mosaics. They still knew how to use shading, use darker hues and values to indicate depth, right? To show that something was further away or closer to us or being hit by light. They understood that. They knew how. So they're deliberately flattening the aspect of images that they're depicting. They're deliberately making things more cartoonish. And I don't mean in the like Daffy Duck sort of cartoon. Cartoon, I mean like sort of a cartoon is a rough drawing of something. So they're kind of doing a rough outline of something. They're sketching the idea, not the reality of it. And that's kind of how they get around that potential maybe not okay religious thing, is by making it clear that they're not representing reality. And in that way, art becomes, for Christian Western Europe, much more symbolic. It's not about depicting the real, it's about depicting the ideas. And that's why there's such an incredible emphasis, or part of the reason why there's such incredible emphasis on symbolism in early Christian art. Like, you have to know how to read that image. If you don't know what the shepherd means, then you're going to be out of it. If you don't know that the peacock is meaningful, then you're like, hey, it's a peacock. But it's not just a peacock, and it's not just a fish, and it's not just an eagle, and it's not just an ox. And you have to know those sort of things, right? So that's part of the reason, Tira. So hopefully that helps. Let's see here. What's my next question coming up here? Tira, what do barrel vaults do? Barrel vaults in general are the high portion of the ceiling. Okay, not a flat ceiling, but a high reaching towards the sky ceiling. So you can have corbelled vaults where you stair step in stones to support the weight of the ceiling over top. You can have rounded barrel vaults. They're called barrel vaults because it's almost as though, do I have anything that would work that I could show you? Nothing that looks like a barrel. Sorry. Nope. Don't have anything. She want a wine glass? That won't really work. We can try though. Okay. All right, whatever. So it's almost as though, this is a terrible example. It's almost as though you could take a circular form and run it down the center nave of a church or anything else, but you could run it down something and it would create sort of a carved out, sort of rounded arch all the way down the nave. And that itself, like, it's called a barrel vault because it looks like the side of a barrel going all the way down. That's why. But vaults in general, all they're doing is they're providing sort of the high ceilings. They're very, very common in churches because it gives that sense of awe and space. Usually they're trying to make things feel otherworldly, to evoke the gods. That's what's going on there. Okay. Allie wants to know what marginalia is. Were you absent that day, Allie, when we did illuminated manuscripts? I think you must have been. Marginalia is some of my favorite stuff. Everybody else knows this because I talked about it forever. Marginalia is the stuff in illuminated manuscripts that is not pertaining to the text, that is not part of the planned illuminated manuscript. There can be different types of marginalia. It is the stuff written in the margins, like commentary. So if you are reading for class, and as you read that book, you're making notes in the margin. Now, you guys probably use sticky notes, but I am a terrible person and I write directly in my textbooks. I can do that because I'm a teacher. I write directly in books that I'm reading for fun because I'm a nerd. So that is marginalia. And believe it or not, like, even modern marginalia is valuable. Like, if you get a book from like William Faulkner's library and he's written his notes in the margins, like, that's a big deal, because it's feedback about what people think about the text that they're reading. So in a lot of medieval the written marginalia is primarily commentary. It's usually serious commentary, but there can be non-serious stuff as well. So you can get things like, this is a reference to St. Augustine, or this is a reference to the lives of saints, et cetera, et cetera. Plato says X. Like, sometimes it can like reference like past Greek or Roman philosophers, although that was more scarce. But that can be interesting because what it tells us is a little bit about the life of that particular book. It tells us about people's thoughts on it. So the marginalia that's written is really fascinating from an academic standpoint. From an artistic standpoint, the marginalia that we tend to focus on is the unplanned doodles or just random illustrations all throughout the text. So let me see if I can pull up a couple of examples that are school appropriate for you, because there's plenty that is not, but I'm not going to show you that. So let me find you some marginalia that is school appropriate. Oh my goodness, so much that is not school appropriate. Okay. All right. Okay. So here, I'm going to show you this one, Allie, because I showed this one in class and I do particularly love it. It's delightful. So here, let me share the screen with you guys. Okay. Oh, hang on. Oh, sorry, I've got it up. Now you're going to be staring down like the rabbit hole here for a moment. Okay, there you go. Hopefully now you've got it. Okay. All right. Okay. So what you can see in front of you is one of my very, very favorite pieces of marginalia. This right here is something that the illustrator added in, the illuminator added in. This would have taken a lot of time. You had to prepare the vellum, you had to paint things, everything. But here we have a knight defeating a snail. Has nothing to do with the text. The text is a long epic poem about like chivalry and stuff. But nowhere in it does the knight actually defeat a snail. That is not part of it. The illustrator apparently just really liked drawing snails and maybe some sort of like, flower tree over here to the left. Not sure. But that one right there is a pretty PG rated one. I'm going to flip it over before I show you something that I probably shouldn't show you. But you guys are well equipped with the power of Google. And if you want to look stuff up, I'm sure you will look stuff up. But let me end this. Okay. Oh, hang on. Did I not share it with you guys? I'm sorry. I totally forgot. There, it's now presenting. So there is our knight defeating a snail. I'm sorry. I forgot to hit the share button. So there you go. So there's marginalia for you. So you can have visual marginalia like that. And sometimes it is depicting monks and nuns doing things that monks and nuns don't do. And I don't mean that in any sort of disrespectful way. Like, sometimes it's just them doing stupid stuff, like fencing on top of snails. For whatever reason, medieval illustrators really liked drawing snails. I don't know. Maybe they were more common then. Possibly they wanted escargot. But marginalia can also be commentary about, hang on, I think I'm screen sharing with everybody. Okay, so I'm going to stop that now. Okay, so marginalia can also be written commentary that is not about, say, the content. So it doesn't have to be written commentary that is like commentary about the Bible or whatever. My personal piece of marginalia ever is a monk basically who had finished writing the Gospels, and at the end it basically says, "I have finished now, may I have a beer?" And that is my personal favorite piece of marginalia ever, because what it does is it kind of brings you into that moment. It makes you realize that, yes, these are holy books, they're religious in their nature, but the people writing them are also people. And I think it really humanizes the text and gives us a better sense of what daily life was during that time period, which I think is really cool. So at any rate, that was my long diatribe about marginalia and why I love it. Okay, Aaron wants to know, was Byzantine art focused on idealism, or was it mainly focused on the religious meaning of the art instead of the aesthetic purposes? What a lovely question. I love that. Okay, yes. 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 So, yeah. Byzantine art is extremely abstracted pretty early on. It becomes very formulaic. What that means is that the facial features of the Virgin Mary look almost identical no matter what church you go to in the 6th, 7th, 8th century in the Byzantine world. They tend to all have the same sort of very serene, very, very elongated nose, almond-shaped eyes, relatively close together. The face is very is an ovoid face. It's an oval face. And the hands are always kind of elongated and held in weird positions. The neck is usually kind of bent at a funny angle. She always looks kind of adoring, but sort of detached from the Christ child. Jesus almost always has longer hair in a traditional Greek style. He has a beard. He's usually fairly dark haired. He too has that elongated nose, those almond shaped eyes. He's usually very placid looking. He doesn't look angry, doesn't look like he's having human emotions, that sort of stuff. And in that way, it is idealized in terms of the spiritual ideal rather than the physical ideal. It is more about spirituality. It's about what's behind the image. It's about the promise behind the image rather than the image itself. So the image is meant to represent the idea rather than what human beings actually look like. So yes, it is very much about the religious meaning of the art rather than, I wouldn't say rather than aesthetic purposes, because artists were still artists and they still liked what they liked. They were trying to, balance the form. If you look at a lot of depictions, particularly icons, the iconic portrayals, look in your 250, you've got the icon picture of Theodore, or Taylor, I guess is the pronunciation. And it's a very, very symmetrical, balanced piece. And that is clearly for aesthetic reasons. The artist likes the way that looks. And that is something that we should take into consideration. But it is also primarily about religious function and religious ideas. So there is that. Ali wants to know, what's the difference between idols and graven images? Are you planning on making some? Graven images is, the term is in reference to sort of like engraving or drawing. So graven images is like me drawing things. So if I draw a picture and I say, this is Ali, that's Ali. And then I put an altar in front of it, and I leave, fruit and such, and maybe Allie's favorite candy. And I put a gold star in a paper that says, you get an A in AP Art History. That would be a problem, perhaps, because maybe I'm not worshiping Allie, but I'm worshiping this actual image of Allie. An idol sometimes can be kind of conflated with that idea of a graven image, where people can act as though the idol is the image is the idol. An idol is a reference to an object that is worshipped either as a god or in place of a god. And in biblical terms, we're talking about there's a portion with like a golden statue of a calf, and then God gets mad at people, and they have to destroy it, and people die, and all sorts of stuff happens. This is why in the Ten Commandments, like God tells the Jewish population, like, thou shalt have no other gods than me. Like, I am, the Lord thy God, the only one. You should only worship me. And he's kind of like reinforcing that after like the whole idol thing. This is a big deal in terms of Byzantine art because it's ultimately going to lead to the iconoclasm controversy, which was basically the debate as to whether or not icons were acceptable in the Byzantine or the Greek Christian church or not. Spoiler alert, they are, but there were wars fought over this as to whether or not people who had religious icons were worshiping idols and graven images, or if they were worshiping the idea of God through those images. Greek Catholics and Russian Orthodox Catholics, etc., today Catholics, excuse me, Russian Orthodox Christians, Greek Orthodox Christians would make the argument instead that no, they don't worship the object or the image. It's the idea behind it. But the image is important. It's a focal point for your prayer. So that's the difference there. Gosh, you can certainly tell I'm getting a little bit tired today because I'm tripping over my words like anything. All right. Sarah wants to know, why is Theodora such an important empress? In terms of artistic production, not so much. In terms of just like sheer awesomeness, Theodora is she's a convert to Christianity. She was an actress, which frequently means that she was a woman who was considered to have less virtue than other women in the Byzantine Empire. Although, to be perfectly frank, if you didn't have a family to protect you, your economic opportunities in the Byzantine Empire prior to Theodora's reign were extremely, extremely limited if you were a woman. That usually meant that prostitution was somewhere in your future. So as a woman, and as empress, Theodora was really important because of her legislation. She passed a number of laws that, number one, they protected women in a lot of ways. It allowed for the education of women and allowed for them to have some businesses on their own. Now, when I say education, I don't mean she opened like Agnes Scott or Spelman. She didn't open colleges for women. They were training centers for really, really basic jobs, things like being a cloth dyer, which is a nasty job at this time, by the way, guys. It involves a lot of urine of various species, and dye did not smell good, and there was sulfur involved. It stank. Or you could work as a laundress. Again, nasty work, but you know what? It wasn't prostitution. She also took the rather radical stance that women who committed adultery should not be put to death, which was kind of impressive. She advocated on behalf of women's right to divorce. She was a supporter of that. She was an interesting lady. Yeah, so like her importance is mostly legislative, not so much in terms of artistic patronage, although she did support the arts. But that's really where I'd go with it. Ali wants to know, can I explain the relationship of between cloisonne and cabochon gemstones? Okay. All right, so cloisonne is that process we talked about by which you decorate metalwork. So if you have a goblet, do I have a goblet? I do have a goblet. Hang on a second. It's not metal, though. If you have a goblet, and let's say it is made out of metal, okay? Let's say it is made out of gold or silver. It's not. It is very cheap glass. I mean, not very cheap, but it's cheap glass. At any rate, and if you wanted to decorate said goblet, what you would do, because you can't glue things very well onto metal, don't know if you noticed this, especially not in the medieval period, they hadn't invented super glue yet. What you did was you would take bits of wire, gold or silver, whatever material it was that you were trying to attach to it, and you would bend the wire into the patterns that you liked, and then very, very carefully and using a lot of heat, you would melt that wire against it, creating patterns on the metalwork itself. And then within that wire, you could put enamel, you could paint. Sometimes they did just paint, but it didn't stick very well and it tends to get removed. You could put inlaid glass. You could put, let's see here, gemstones. And gemstones were commonly used in a lot of West European cloisonne. Cloisonne is not specifically European. Cloisonne is just the technique of using those wires to describe sections, partitions of a piece of metal, and then you add materials in between of it. So if you added enamel, you could do cloisonne vases in, say, the Ming Dynasty in China, and they certainly did. And they also did that in Japan as well with a lot of enamel work. So cloisonne is across the board. It's not just a Western European thing. But the use of gemstones, they tended to do cloisonne around a lot of gemstones, particularly garnets. Garnets on gold was a really common thing in Western Europe, especially during the migration period. Part of it was because garnets have that really deep, rich red color, and it was thought to be kind of like, the blood of Christ. So garnet cloisonne is particular to a lot of sort of Northern French into the British Isles tradition, a lot of garnet cloisonne. And cabochon cuts for gemstones were really common during this period. So cabochon is essentially where you take the gemstone and you have this tall arch, not tall, but essentially it's like a rounded top to it. It's not faceted. To facet a gemstone means that it has planes on it. I'll draw it out for you guys so you guys can see. This is what you're thinking of when you think of like diamonds and such. Diamonds are usually today cut in faceted patterns. And the idea is that they maximize light and they sparkle, right? So a diamond is faceted. It has a lot of different planes to it. And so the light hits those planes, it refracts, it sparkles. Cabochon doesn't have that. A cabochon cut, essentially, there's no facet to it, so it doesn't refract light. But it is smooth and glossy, and you get kind of the depth of the color. So cabochon cuts tend to be used for really dark, rich gemstones, things like really deep blue sapphires, emeralds, garnets. Again, garnets are the big ones. Sometimes topazes. Sometimes you could do cabochon cut for like amber. Less often for diamonds, although they did do it, because it allows you to see really kind of the depth of the color. So cabochon cuts are pretty common with regards to Western European cloisonne. Hopefully that helps. I don't know. I sound like I'm about to like work for like a jewelry company or something. Okay. Okay, Sarah Baker, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Okay, Sarah wanted to know about what's the difference between worshiping an idol and a relic. That is a good question. I assume the Nevermind pertains to that one, but a relic is supposedly an object or part of a body. It could be like the bones or whatever of a saint or someone who is important in Christian or frankly in other faiths too. I mean, like there are reliquaries in African traditions, right? And they hold the remains of ancestors. And there are reliquaries or rather there are relics or burials of relics in Buddhist stupas. So this is kind of an idea that crosses a lot of cultural borders. And if you wanted to make comparisons, which you should make comparisons, definitely that would be someplace where you could look for that. And is an object containing cloisonne an example of status symbol art? Yeah. It can be. Status symbol art is usually stuff that is, first of all, it's going to be made out of fine materials like gold, silver, gemstones, expensive things. Ivory is another status symbol material. And it is going to be something that is, that not everybody has. So a status symbol piece would be something that shows your wealth. So everybody in Western Europe at the time of, say, the migration period, most people wore fibulae, those pins that held sort of like cloaks together and shut your clothing and everything. Everybody wore fibulae. It wasn't sort of like decorative pins like the one I've got on right now. It was stuff that was practical, but everybody had them. So they weren't anything special. But to show your status, you would bling them out. You would make them super sparkly and everything. Like, more sparkle, the better, right? So you would make things very, very elaborately sparkly, and that would be a way that you would show your status. So status symbol art can be everything from necklaces, jewelry, rings, hairpins. It could be even the hilt of a sword for a man. It could be his belt buckle. It could be a clasp on a leather satchel. Anything that is expensive and very, very decorative, something that illustrates your wealth. That's status symbol art. Okay, let's see here. Sarah wants to know what caused the Nika riots. Oh, Justinian caused the Nika riots. The Emperor Justinian in the 500s, he wanted to retake the glory of the Roman Empire. That meant that he had to collect enough taxes in order to pay the military to do that sort of thing. That is not inexpensive work. So in order to be able to do that, he taxed really heavily. But because he didn't want to anger his political allies, he didn't tax the wealthy that heavily. He taxed the poor. And the fact of the matter is that if you tax the poor people too long, eventually they get very, very angry. And the thing about poor people, especially in Justinian's empire, is that there were a lot of them. So eventually what happens is, in the city of Constantinople, there is a big horse racing stadium called the Hippodrome. There's one in Rome as well. It's pretty cool. And people would go to the Hippodrome to be amused, sort of like the Colosseum. Are you not entertained? But they would also go to watch their favorite chariot racing team, and they also, it was sort of panem et circenses, meaning bread and circuses, so you could get some free food if you went. So if you were poor, you tended to hang out at the Hippodrome a whole lot. And usually what would happen is, before major races would start, the emperor would appear on the balcony, he'd wave to the crowd, he'd drop the handkerchief, and the races would start. Well, usually what happened is people would boo the other team, because like chariots raced in teams, it's a thing. And they would, talk trash and yell at each other, throw things at each other. But at this particular moment, everybody hates Justinian. So he shows up on the balcony, gets ready to drop the handkerchief. Everybody starts booing him, and they start shouting, Nika, Nika. Nika is derived from the Greek Nike. Think about like Nike as the spirit of victory, right? But in this context, Nika means conquest or overthrow. So essentially, there's a whole bunch of angry people in a stadium yelling, overthrow, overthrow at the emperor. Ultimately, they get so furious, they start breaking out of the stands. There's riots for 3 days in Constantinople. About a third of the city burns down. Justinian about flees the city. His wife Theodora basically tells him to man up, says, the quote is, purple's a great color for a funeral. Referring to sort of the royal purple. And she sticks it out, convinces him to stick it out, and then he decides to put down the riots by inviting the leaders of the revolts into the Hippodrome for peace talks, and then has his guards surround the stadium and slaughter them all. He kills 30,000 people. But good news is that a third of the city of Constantinople was therefore cleared because of the widespread fires, and that allowed him to undertake his beautification program, including the building of the Hagia Sophia. So there you go. What is spolia? Okay, so spolia is, in this particular context, it's in reference to the reliquary of Saint Foy. But spolia is where you take the remnants of an older statue, in this case particularly Roman, and then you incorporate it into something modern. So that's spolia. Okay. What is the significant? Tara wants to know what the significance of the Merovingian, I can never say that word, I'm so sorry, looped fibulae. So the fibulae is status symbol art, but moreover, Tara, it's a good example of a lot of non-Roman Germanic techniques and styles in terms of artistic production. It also is pushing back. Part of the reason why it's included in the image set is it's trying to push back against the notion that Germanic groups didn't produce anything worthwhile, that they were all truly barbarians, and they weren't. I mean, if you take a look at those pieces, clearly those are people of substance and style and artistic skill. So So yeah, that's the example there. That's why it's there. Is it's an example of status symbol art, but also think about the abstraction of form. There are eagles in the fibulae, there are fish in the fibulae, but they're abstracted to such an extent that if you're not looking for them, it's hard to see them. There's also Christian iconography beyond the eagle and fish. There's also a cross, dead center, but it's hard to see if you're not really paying attention to it. Also, look at sort of the intricate patterns along the edges there. That's a good indication of sort of the tendency to use a lot of abstracted patterns that we see coming out of Germanic groups. Think about sort of insular artistic styles and the interlaced designs. That's sort of a precursor to it. So, any other questions, guys? Just about to 7:30, and I do want to stop at some point. I assume that you guys probably need to eat dinner at some point, possibly, do other things, study, do homework, watch television. So I will give you a moment to ask any final questions, and then I'll sign off. Ah, there it is. I knew there'd be a last second question there. Okay, so what's the importance of insular art? Okay, so insular art is really cool, and it's actually some of my favorite stuff from this period because it is so isolated from the rest of everything else. Insular art really emerges out of British monasteries, and I say British with like the big B, meaning like the British Isles included, okay, and that includes both Ireland as well as the Isle, as well as like England and Scotland and Wales, and Ireland was never conquered by Rome. Okay, which meant that it was exposed to Christianity later. So it didn't have the same sort of emphases or sort of hang-ups about Roman art because it just didn't have that. So a lot of the artistic expression that we see coming from insular art is distinctly Celtic in its origin. It is non-Roman. It does learn a few Roman forms, but it's not really concerned with a lot of Roman or Roman style iconography or rules. So this is why we see the emphasis on that really heavy interlaced design. Think about the carpet pages from like the Lindisfarne Gospel, where it's just that solid block of brilliant color and really elaborate pattern building. It is to a certain degree geometric. It is to a certain degree symmetrical within the geometric designs, in that it kind of like if there's a heavy L shape down here, there's a circle up here that kind of balances it out, but it's not exactly symmetrical. And that sort of willingness to move away from sort of a rigid emphasis on symmetry and sort of mathematical precision is what really interests me about insular art. And you can see that flow back across the channel, also into England, Scotland, Wales. You can see that kind of flow back across the channel into northern France with, say, like the relief sculptures and the capitals coming into Romanesque cathedrals, because you have this sort of willingness to play with form and to play with the fit of figures within things. Very frequently, a lot of insular art just kind of takes the letters as the shape and then bends everything to fit within it. And it makes it feel very fluid, very playful, which I love, particularly that it's coming out of a religious text, right? So you have this religious text, which is very, very serious. And then you have these beautiful, sort of playful and very joyous sort of pieces of art. And that's one thing that starts to develop during the insular period that moves to Romanesque into Gothic art. Remember, like, I mean, if you think about if you think about the light and the interplay of like all of the forms in those windows, that is not a doom and gloom building. That is not a place that has no sense of humor. That is a place of sort of light and joy and sort of that brilliant color, that pattern, that's coming from insular art. If you think about, say, the Last Judgment over the front doors at the facade of Saint Foy. those are like the way that they kind of cram the figures in. Yeah, it's doom and gloom. You're looking at people being dragged off into hell, but there's something playful about the way that they've kind of depicted this, the devils and everything. Yeah, it's meant to frighten you, but there's a real sort of like the artist was having fun with the figures, and you can tell, and that's kind of coming from insular art. So that's why I would say it's super important. Anything else? Because we are coming right in at 7:30, and I don't want to hold you guys late, and I also want to finish my hot chocolate, which is now cold chocolate. We good? Okay. I'm not seeing anybody rush for questions. So hopefully that helps, guys. Let me know, and happy studying. I will see you later.